We're going to get started. So welcome, everyone. I'd like to start this conference with a land acknowledgement. The University of Illinois Chicago is located on the homelands of the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Miamia, Peoria, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, Fox, and many other native groups historically use this area for gathering, healing, and trade. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that Indigenous peoples lived here long before Chicago was a city and are still thriving here today. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonization and state violence and support Indigenous communities struggling for self-determination and sovereignty. I acknowledge I'm a guest on this land and offer my respect and gratitude to the over 75,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois today. With that, I'd also like to welcome you to Chicago, to UIC, and to the DHI's conference, Recovery and Community, Multiethnic Digital Humanities in 2022. I'm so glad that we can all gather here today and throughout the week. If you could please wear a mask throughout this conference, we would appreciate it, other than when you're speaking. My name is Alexis Guilbault, and I'm the director of the Digital Humanities Initiative, which is a partnership between the Institute for the Humanities and the University Library. I'd like to kick off the conference with a short reflection on the beginnings of my exposure to digital humanities, or DH. Then I'll explain how that exposure led to me excitingly tackling the theme of this conference, which is supported by a grant focused on multi-ethnic digital humanities from the University of Illinois Presidential Initiative. My first experiences in digital humanities were playful. I started by listening to conference planning meetings at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, as a history master's student. I overheard conversations about digital humanities sandboxes in 2012, people playing and learning in the field, and of various humanities scholars creating workshops on the spot on digital tools based on the needs of the room. While this work seemed somewhat whimsical to me, the historians and librarians I listened to always returned to the stakes of digital work for the people they were working with and who their work was about. This awareness led to more important questions and conversations about audience and sources, which are critical to DH. I was intrigued, and I continued to watch the field grow at Indiana University. There, I worked on a PhD in history, focusing on slavery and Native American history in the Ohio Valley, and I also worked at the Journal of American History. There, I noticed scholars in my own fields, including some in this room today, who wrote about using digital tools, letting Indigenous and other diverse communities drive their scholarship, and convening digitally and in person around topics such as Black digital practices. My role at the DHI at UIC allowed me to combine these observations of a decade of digital humanities in action and my scholarly and personal interest through the theme of this conference, multi-ethnic digital humanities. This theme, of course, encompasses projects that discuss people of various ethnicities, but multi-ethnic can also be defined as relating to, reflecting, or adapting to diverse ethnicities. To be multi-ethnic in your scholarship, pedagogy, or other projects is to work with the goal in mind of, again, relating to, reflecting, or adapting to diverse ethnicities. Indeed, across disciplines and within communities, individuals and groups have developed a collection of related approaches to investigate a range of ethnic, national, and social groups. Turning to the second part of this theme, digital humanities, to me, the digital humanities consists of a collection of digital tools and research and engagement practices. This toolbox, or a toolbox that you can play with in a sandbox, allows people to critique, present, and analyze humanities data and learn of its various uses. Scholars in DH also explore how the humanities can shape computing in the modern digital world. With both of these approaches in mind, I conceive of multi-ethnic digital humanities as a field that shares, studies, and develops rigorous and yet approachable practices for multi-ethnic work in the digital realm. Over the next few days, we will explore the ways that digital platforms and methods both advance the scholarship on race and ethnicity and connect underrepresented communities, identities, histories, languages, and cultures with scholars, students, and interested publics. We have gathered digital humanities practitioners and people interested in the field that employ various digital practices. We'll hear from people with varying expertise, including librarians, graduate students, English and media studies professors, cultural and digital humanities center leaders, historians, undergraduate students, anthropologists, and more. Everyone here comes to the conference with a distinct but related goal. It might include community-based work, critiquing digital work in space, developing better and more responsible digital tools and partnerships, looking for ideas for your own research or teaching, or just to listen. But I'm happy all of you are here. Before we officially get started, I'd like to thank Mark Kenwell, the director of the Institute for the Humanities, who coached me through every aspect of conference planning and made it incredibly fun. I'd also like to thank the DHI and Institute GRAs, the graduate research assistants, Rachel Zine, Craig Raymond in the back, and Elisa Soto, whose work on the beautiful conference materials and also much more work made this conference possible. Thank you also to Linda Vavra, the former the assistant director of the Institute, for her wisdom and event planning, and also to our new assistant director who started this week, Katie Corboy, who really just jumped in to help us with the conference this week, and to everyone else who emailed with me to make this conference possible. Thank you. Also, thank you to the presenters for your time and work. I know we'll all benefit from learning from you and your work in DH. And the audience, thank you all for being here. It'll make for a rich conversation. So with that, I'll turn to our first panel. So we will start with a conversation about critical digital humanities, moderated by Teresa Helena Moreno. And I'm going to introduce Teresa, and then we'll get started. Teresa Helena Moreno is an assistant professor and librarian for the Department of Black Studies in the College of Architecture, Design, and the Arts. Her approaches to information science are deeply rooted in feminist theory and center and reframe the voices of those not reflected in dominant culture. She teaches on the intersections of social justice and the politics of information, in which her students create digital stories that reflect their research. Teresa is currently researching the ways information sciences misunderstand the diaspora and how it works with diasporic content. So I'd like to welcome the first panel up, and we'll get started. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that really lovely introduction, and I am so excited to be here today, to be in conversation with all of you. You all are doing such amazing, interesting things. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists, and then the panelists are going to come and talk a little bit about their individual work, and then we're gonna have a conversation about all of our work together. And please feel free to ask questions and stuff when we get to that portion. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So first up, we have Yena Lee. So Yena Lee is a doctoral student in Media Technology and Society program at the Northwestern School of Communication. Yena Lee is a PhD student in Media Technology and Society program. Oh, I just said that, y'all. It's in my notes twice. I just really wanted to make sure you all knew where Yena came from. She's interested in studying the emerging forms and processes of networked social movements and the technological, political, and organizational conditions that enable or challenge the rise of such movements. Her research aims to better understand the changing logics of social movement at both levels of conscious raising and policymaking through an interdisciplinary and comparative lens. Her most recent research, published in Information Communication and Society Journal, looks at the role of leadership in feminist networked social movements in South Korea. She has previously written about feminist activist chatbot in Brazil and feminist K-pop fan activism on Twitter. And then next in our row of panelists is Kellee Warren. Kellee is an assistant professor and special collections librarian here at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Ms. Warren's most recent article, Toward an Afro-Asian Hip-Hop Dance Pedagogy, was published in Conversations Across the Field of Dance, a special issue on anti-Asian hate. The article is a critical reflection of highlighting her collaborative and pedagogical approach to working with disciplinary faculty, teaching an oral history workshop, and holding and preserving a collection of student-created oral history interviews. Her 2020 article, Reimagining Special Collections Instruction, A Special Case of Haiti, was published in The American Archivist and documents a perspective on preserving archival instruction with colonial collections. In 2016, Ms. Warren's article, "We Need These Bodies But Not Their Knowledge, Black Women in Archival Science Profession and Their Connection to the Archives of Enslaved Women in French Ateliers," was published in Library Trends. Ms. Warren's research interests include critical pedagogies, digital humanities, and oral histories. And last but not least, we have Maria Cotera, who is an associate professor of Mexican American and Latina Studies at the University of Texas. Dr. Cotera is, oh wow, I did it again, y'all. It's in there twice. I was like, it's just really, I don't know what I was doing, y'all. Okay. Let me see. Okay, she holds a PhD from Stanford's University's programs in modern thought and an MA in English from the University of Texas. Her first book, Native Speakers, Ella Deloria, Zora Neale Hurston, and Javier Gonzalez, and the Poetics of Culture, received the Gloria Anzaldúa Book Prize for 2019 from the National Women's Studies Association, also known as NWSA. Her edited volume, Chicana Movidas, Narratives of Feminism and Activism in the Movement, has been adopted in courses across the country. Professor Cotera is one of the co-founders and project director of Chicana por Mi Raza Digital Memory Collective, an online interactive archive of oral histories and material documenting Chicana feminist praxis over the long civil rights period. She has curated several public history exhibits, including Los Rebeldes, Stories of Strength and Struggle in Southeast Michigan, and Chicano Photos, Nancy de los Santos, and currently serves as the advisor consultant numbers at large-scale digital humanities projects focusing on the Latinx experience. Professor Cotera has served on the National Council for the American Studies Association, with the governing board of the Latino Studies Association, and the program committee for the National Women's Studies Association. So with that,
I want to start by thanking the Digital Humanities Initiative at UIC for inviting me to speak at this panel. I'm really excited. I situate my research at the intersection of Fen Studies and Digital Humanities Scholarship. And in the next few slides, I'm going to start by telling you some of the interventions I want to make to the scholarship that lies at this intersection. Okay. So first of all, when we think of data, the most common form of data in DH scholarship now, it's text, right? Text is so tractable, it's great for computational analysis, but text is, and I've come across many research that use computational methods to study Fen fiction archives when it comes to Fen research. However, computational methods not really great for situating data in the context of the relationships that people make, for example, on social media platforms that give rise to those data like Fen fiction, right? So that's what I want to emphasize today, and I'm gonna now talk about social media platforms. Okay, so online communities and social media platforms. It's a well-known fact that social media platforms act like a double-edged sword. While it can encourage counter-discourse, can also amplify polarization. And a lot of people attribute social media algorithm as a cause for polarization. However, in his book, Breaking the Social Media Prism, Chris Bale argues, which I summarize here, that even though social media algorithm does act like a prism, amplifying and distorting people's behaviors and perceptions, we cannot ignore the relational needs and norms that incentivize people to boost certain content over others in the first place. And that is why I want to study the relationships, or more specifically, the grammar of relationality, which I define as the rules governing how people relate to one another. There's a lack of research on depolarizing the relationship that actors of a network public share with one another, and my research asks, how could oppositional actors challenge and transform the toxic relational norms of how can oppositional actors challenge and transform the toxic relational norms of the existing dominant public and create a counter public where oppositional discourse could prosper? And in the case of my research, that existing dominant public would be the mainstream K-pop fandom, and the challenging actors will be the feminist fans that have created a feminist counter public in Twitter K-pop fandom to challenge the toxic relational norms of mainstream K-pop fandom, which I'll talk to later in the presentation. Okay, and the second intervention I want to make is I want to localize DH, right? It's a well-known fact that there's a geographic imbalance in DH scholarship, and I argue that localizing DH is a step toward decolonizing DH, and what I mean by that. So let's think of some of the social phenomena that were once local but became global, became viral, leading mass media to displace the local with the global. And I argue that K-pop K-pop is one of those social phenomena that were once local but became global, right? And with the increasing globalization of K-pop and K-pop fandom, K-pop fandom has been perceived as this voice for political activism. When I type in K-pop fandom and social justice, all these articles come up explaining how K-pop fans have distributed resources for the movement for Black Lives and trolled Trump and the organizers of his Oklahoma rally. However, this sweeping generalization, I argue, erases the exploitative nature of K-pop system that really undermines its subversive potential. So in Korean, K-pop celebrities are commonly referred to as idols, which I think is a salient term considering how much these celebrity agencies train fans to idolize their celebrities. So by rewarding and punishing fans for their degree of investment, like differentiating fan membership benefits based on the number of songs streamed and the number of albums purchased, I argue that idol agencies instill a top-down notion of what a good fan versus bad fan is. And this gets reverberated and amplified on social media platforms by the fans that have normalized these norms. And as a result, K-pop fandom has grown into this collaborative, cohesive collective, powerful enough to take over trending hashtags, but not progressive or subversive enough to criticize K-pop idol system or hold idols accountable for their misbehaviors or problematic deeds. And this is why I want to argue that we have to localize K-pop, not just in a geographic sense, but in a material sense, with a focus on the material realities that K-pop fans go through. And that's why I chose to study feminist fans that have challenged these relational norms that have prevented fans from speaking out, criticizing their idols. And this feminist activism was started by some fans of BTS, everyone familiar with BTS, who first started raising awareness of what they describe as misogynist acts and comments and lyrics by BTS. And this activism spread to other fandoms and started a productive conversation around feminism and intersectionality around K-pop. So, and I want to emphasize that this is not the first nor the last time that K-pop fans have criticized their idols for racist comments or cultural appropriation. Many Black, Brown, Southeast Asian fans have criticized and they were cyberbullied and antagonized as anti-fans. And this is a similar logic with which feminist fans were silenced in 2016 when this movement happened. So I introduced the concept of relational strategies to ask this research question. What relational strategies did feminist fans adopt to challenge and create a counterpublic where they could transform mainstream K-pop fandom's toxic ways of relating? So for my research, I conducted digital ethnography. So I identified some key hashtags that were trending at the time about this movement, and those led me to some of the more vocal feminist fans, and I expanded my network like that. And I conducted digital ethnography for about 11 months, during which time I also conducted ethnographic interviews and attended offline events that these feminist fans organized. And my analysis is a result of dual layers of translation: one, a linguistic translation, Korean to English, and one, a cultural translation of the key fandom lingo that have surfaced in my analysis. And what is interesting to me that this linguistic translation from Korean to English actually helped me to get closer to the local meanings that fans have attached to these keywords that were once subsidiary to my analysis, and I think they were important, but became the centerpiece of my analysis of relationality. And that is why in the rest of my slides, I'm going to talk about a total of 7 keywords that I think that are important from the order that will lead us from the relational strategies that fans adopted initially to reform the public sphere, which I call the pre-formative stage, to eventually creating a counter-public, which I call the formative stage. All right, so in the pre-formative stage, the goal of feminist fans was to convince idols and their fans that sexist lyrics, comments, and actions are indeed problematic, right? And how did they do that? They co-opted the dominant public's cultural repertoires. So what is cultural repertoire? And Swidler defines cultural repertoire as a set of resources and tools with which individuals and groups can use to construct strategies of action for different contexts. And this concept is useful for thinking about how feminist fans drew from the familiar cultural repertoire of K-pop fandom to curate their message to be recognizable and identifiable to K-pop fans. And one was an egg account. What is an egg account? So egg account refers to Twitter accounts with no profile picture. They're anonymous. So back then in 2016, I don't know if you remember, egg used to be the default profile picture of Twitter. And this anonymity really symbolizes the erasure of a individual fan identity, and makes whatever the issue the account is about into fandom issue, into collective issue. And the first feminist fans to reappropriate this egg account were BTS feminist fans. And so they created this account called Bangtan Boys Misogyny Awareness. So back then, BTS used to be called Bangtan Boys. So by making that account, they really wanted to raise awareness and explain why they thought some of the lyrics and comments, actions that BTS members had made in the past were misogynistic, and really demand BTS and the idol agencies for some sort of response to this controversy. And the second cultural repertoire that was reappropriated was a form of letter. So they wrote a letter to BTS, and letter is a form of communication that is associated with feelings of affection and intimacy. In the letter, they paired this sort of more overt form of sexist lyric, pairing Bossy Girl with gonorrhea, to more covert one, the one you see on the tweet. And by doing that, they really wanted to emphasize that these actions and comments and lyrics could hurt the relationship of the idols with their fans. Even though they criticized BTS, they really subscribed to the relational vernacular of a concerned fan. They were like, oh, this isn't affectionate advice. We're, trying to make you successful. That's why we're doing that. So all these actions, by doing that, BTS, this awareness account, really set the example by turning feminist activism into a new form of fans managing their idols, right? Fans are expected to manage their idols, and feminism activism became one way that fans could do that to make their idols successful. So it was during the formative stage that feminist fans started to actively regroup around a feminist consciousness. But how could they do that when they lack a central collective identity or leadership? They did that by establishing cultural repertoires and fostering collaborative spaces of knowledge production and critical discourse. So awareness accounts, it spread to other fandoms. And awareness accounts became sort of this cultural repertoire associated with feminist activism. It spread to other fandoms, and this network and those awareness accounts really facilitated a network of feminist fans who follow these accounts to find other fans, to talk about misogyny and feminism in K-pop. And so the second relational strategy was rejecting collective identity and grouping around differences over similarities. So what really galvanized this regroupment process was that the mainstream fans started labeling feminist fans as anti-fans and pitting feminist fans against each other. So what they did was that they started to criticize this fandom practice called RPS, which is real person / fan fictions featuring male idols engaged in homosexual relationships. So RPS is not really a problematic thing in K-pop, it's a common thing, but however, the mainstream fans started criticizing feminist fans for the sake of criticizing them, calling them sexual offenders. However, instead of ostracizing feminist fans who engage in RPS from their feminist network to avoid criticism, what the feminist fan network did is they started looking inwards and started recognizing there are differences in the feminist network, right? So one cool thing that they did is that they reappropriated a label that mainstream fans were using to label them. So a metafan, the mainstream fans started calling feminist fans like metafans. You're a metafan because you're critical of everything. You're a metafan, right? However, instead of identifying themselves as metafan, the feminist fans turned meta into a verb. So this is where the Korean translation comes in. So instead of being a meta, doing meta. It's called meta 덕질 because 덕 means fan, 질 means action. So meta 덕질 means doing fan. And this forming an alternative consciousness around doing critical fan, doing meta instead of being a fan, really signifies fans' resistance in having their critical perspectives define who they are, define their fan identity, and a connected acknowledgement, right, that critical perspectives can differ and fans can have different ideas in what meta 덕질 consists of. Okay, so and then this interview script really shows sort of the significance and the subtle difference between meta 덕질 and metafan, right? So it was when I was trying to translate meta 덕질 into English, I was like, wait, I can't because word fan is not used as a verb in English. It's like fanning. And I was like, wait, could it be significant that Korean fans are using this in a verb sense? So I went back to the script and I was able to identify this fan's hesitancy in identifying herself as a meta fan and instead clarifying what meta 덕질 meant to her, what doing meta meant to her. The last relational strategy is building a feminist counterpublic by putting collective reimagination of an alternative K-pop fandom into practice. So what it means is that K-pop feminist fans started not only recognizing but expressing those differences and making it part of their collective reimagination of what an alternative K-pop fandom network could look like. So they created this account called WOW accounts because some of them believe that consuming paparazzi photos is not ethical. So they created this genre of idol archive, photo archive that did not feature paparazzi photos. And others made fan-made magazines, really critically reflecting on fandom practices. So there's this word called 빠순. It's a gendered term, derogative term used to refer to female fans. And what these fans did is that instead of just attributing positive meaning to it, they started to critically reflect on some of the toxic fandom practices that fans have been adhering to in the name of being a 빠순. So lastly, I want to emphasize this account, Family Basun Habu, I forgot to explain in my method section, but this account posted my interview recruitment message, right? And the reason why I connected with this account is that it was a kind of a connector account. It started the account really wanted to connect feminist friends and really have feminist friends engage in a more personal level. So they organized offline parties where they had games like vote for the most misogynistic lyric of all time, and they started representing feminist voices, femme voices in queer festivals and feminism festivals. So by studying the relational strategies that feminist fans adopted throughout the formation of Counterpublic, I conclude that this Counterpublic is a process of it's a result of iterative process of co-constructing a group culture that provided meaningful opportunities for relationship building and collaborative discourse. Thank you.
I am going to talk to you today about a collaborative project. It didn't start with me. It started here at UIC. The collaboration involved UIC's Global Asian Studies, the University Library, and Special Collections. So initially, the project started with a faculty member. His name is a former faculty member. His name is Professor Lorenzo Perillo, and he is now at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. But he was here in Global Asian Studies. In the University Library, there was an undergraduate engagement librarian that he worked with, and then the university archivist. So they came up with this plan to document, create a digital archive of his course, Global Hip Hop and Asian Diasporas. And the library was going to deliver the oral history workshop. So initially, the first library faculty member and the university archivist, they co-taught the oral history workshop, and then it was turned over to me because you know how academic environments go, there's some turnover. So I inherited the project from the faculty member in the main library. So it's just me teaching the oral history workshop and working with Professor Perillo. So this collaboration started in 2016 and ended in 2020. And guess why it ended in 2020? So what I like to focus on in this project is collaborative pedagogy. And my area of research that I try to incorporate in my archival instruction is culturally sustaining pedagogy. And in this context, we really wanted to focus on embodied knowledge. And we came up with this concept while we were in conversation, because this manuscript is a representation of a critical reflection, as Teresa mentioned. We came up with this concept of coasting. Because I started doing the research, okay, so let me just tell you how funny this is. So a little bit of background on me, and this is archival nature and critical race theory nature, which is starting out with a story. So I'm a storyteller. So basically, I grew up in Hyde Park. I grew up on the University of Chicago campus. So I was kind of used to, being around a diverse set of classmates, a diverse set of people. And then we moved out to the south suburbs, and at that particular time, the high school that I attended was pretty much majority white. So in that high school experience and then further into my adulthood, I sort of forget those sorts of diverse relationships that you had. I grew up with Latino, Latinas, Asian American students, so on and so forth. So anyway, when Annie, her name is Annie Fo, this is the the former undergraduate engagement librarian. It's difficult to talk about this. Annie Fo, and she approached me about working with Professor Perillo. And the first question that popped into my head, I was like, what do Asian people have to do with hip hop? Of course, working with Professor Perillo was sort of a recovery project, and what Toni Morrison called rememory, because there is definitely sort of a creolization in the history of hip hop. So there were Asian people involved in the establishment of hip hop, of course, Black people, Latinos, Latinas were involved in the history of hip hop, but for me, it was just sort of remembering those relations. So anyway, we focused on collaborative pedagogy. We wanted to document the project. We started out in sort of this traditional sort of approach. We were trying to be creative in the opening, so we were thinking about using a performative method in writing the first part of the manuscript and then going into case studies, like listening to the student generated interviews, so on and so forth. However, COVID arrives, events of 2020 and 2021, so I don't want to miss anyone because I actually did write the names down, but we all know that George Floyd happened. We know that Breonna Taylor happened. At the same time George Floyd was killed, a Filipino man named Angelo Quinto was murdered in the same way. The police knelt on his neck. There were also the Atlanta spa shootings. And then there was a man, South African rugby player, who was shot in Honolulu, Lindani Mayani. So because we were both tenure track, the initial approach was to take sort of a traditional route to documenting this relationship in this project. But after those particular flashpoints, those events, that sort of started to reshape our conversation. And by that time, Professor Perillo had moved to Hawaii. So then there was also this sort of shift in time zones. So we were 5 hours apart, and we had to figure out how to navigate and schedule the meetings. But this sort of changed our approach to what we wanted to talk about, and then also changed our reflection on the project and working with the students, and the limitations as well. So anyway, this concept of coasting. So in our research, I was researching Afro and specifically Filipino relations, Black American and Filipino relations, and found that the relationships were documented on the coasts. So in the literature, you will find lots of information on Filipino and Black relations in California. You will find it in New York. However, it's sort of buried or invisibilized in the Midwest. So this project serves as a sort of a recovery of a hidden history of Afro-Asian relations in the Midwest. So Professor Perillo and I came up with this concept of coasting, which refers to the reality that the literature often locates Afro-Asian formations on the coasts. But we think that coasting reveals the migration of both Black and Filipino peoples to the Midwest. This course and workshop being developed at an R1 university in Chicago is a recovery of Afro-Asian formations in the Midwest through a Black feminist and queer formation. So basically, I taught traditional approaches to oral history when I had the students in the library. I taught them about informed consent. I taught them about the tools that they would need. I taught them about composing questions for their interviewees. And then also we taught them about the tools of uploading those interviews, whether they be audio or a combination of audio visual, to our sort of, I wouldn't say it's and this is the critique that I have, like oftentimes with, unfortunately, with public institutions, we don't have a lot of money for fancy preservation software. So basically, we have to use Box to preserve temporarily the interviews. And then also too, because I'm a special collections librarian, I come in at different points of the life cycle. So for me, with the interviews being held in Box, that's not really a preservation sort of solution. And we cannot offer, because of privacy issues too, so that's my other concern, privacy and access. We can't allow the public or researchers to have access to the materials for a certain period of time. So these are sort of some of the complications, the issues that arise when you work on a project like this. But anyway, we focused on helping the students build experience and skills with the digital tools to document their history. And then also, like I said, concerns about digital preservation and access. So let me see. One of the points I wanted to make is that in culturally sustaining pedagogy, embodied knowledge, so Django Paris is the scholar, and H. Sami Alim are the scholars who came up with culturally sustaining pedagogy. One of the things that Professor Perillo and I realized is that with culturally sustaining pedagogy, they don't really focus on embodied knowledge. So we wanted to highlight embodied knowledge and how different ethnic communities, this is an important form of knowledge. So this is where this hip hop dance performance archive comes in, is that it's documenting this form of embodied, multi-ethnic embodied knowledge. So this is a perfect example of how you all, if you have ideas about doing multi-ethnic digital humanities collections or projects, can work with other people in other units or disciplines to document that history. Okay, thank you.
My name is Maria Cotera, and I'm here to talk to you about a project, the Chicana por Mi Raza Digital Memory Project, which is a collective of historians, educators, students, researchers, archivists, and technologists across multiple institutions and in community sites dedicated to preserving Chicanx and Latinx histories. Myself and Dr. Linda Garcia Merchant started the project in 2009, and a digital archivist, Marcos Seiferli Valencia, who was at U of M at the time, joined us in 2013. So just an overview of the project. This is a post-custodial project. We conduct oral history interviews and scan archives on site. Our focus group is Chicana activists from the 1960s and 70s. Students work extensively on the project at every aspect of the workflow, and they often travel with us to do interviews. They also catalog materials that we collect. They scan, they digitize. We have developed a repository of over 20,000 items, including newspapers, letters, photos, and hundreds of oral histories. It is the largest repository of Chicana feminist praxis in the world. It also probably is the only digital repository of Chicana feminist praxis in the world. So we collect these. You were talking about infrastructure. We collect these materials in an online repository, a data management system called Clouder that was developed for the natural sciences. It's open source. Most of the labor in putting it together is at the front end, like getting it installed. But once it's there, it's really easy to use. We also have a public-facing website that's used by educators and students across the country. And moving into social media, our students run our Instagram sites. And the project really happens because of partner projects. This is something that we've been developing over the last about 5 years, a sort of increased turning to partners who are working on the ground. So the project is really an intervention into civil rights history, particularly history of the Chicano movement and the women's movement, which often sort of frames the narrative either on the stories of men and male leadership or on white women. And so these pictures kind of are classic pictures from the period that have framed how we think about the Chicano movement and feminists within the Chicano movement. But we're really interested in the women who are sort of bringing these two worlds together. I call this an absent presence. We knew it was an absence because of the presence of archives in our midst. Both Linda and I are the daughters of activists. Linda's mother is actually a Chicano movement activist, Latino movement activist here in Chicago for many years in the 1970s. And my mother, founder of the Chicano Research and Learning Center, was also very active in Chicano movement and women's movement, mainstream women's movement. And they both had amassed gigantic archives. So we knew that this archival material existed, and that the reason that women weren't being written about in historiography is because it didn't exist in traditional libraries, right? This is what the traditional archive looks like, and I as someone who's worked in archives really my entire professional life, I can tell you they're not incredibly accessible spaces, right? This is what, albeit organized, I will say this is what the Chicana archive looks like. I've stopped calling this an archive and calling it more like an archipelago of memory, because it's spread out across impersonal locations, right? These are personal collections that are spread out, in home offices, under beds and closets and basements, attics, and garages. And in fact, this is an image from our trip to California in 2010 at Yolanda Alanisa's garage. Socialist, lesbian, feminist, archivist, and librarian. So, really, because of the personal nature of the archives that we collect, the archival space is really transformed in our collecting practices. And so I've written a lot about how our project reimagines the archive not as a static site or a repository or a mine to be excavated, right, by scholars, but rather as a site of encuentro or encounter. And encuentro is a Latin American term, political term, that usually is sort of referencing encounters, but not just, not depoliticized encounters. Encuentros are usually about, people from different spaces, regional areas, et cetera, coming together to learn from each other. So we sort of started thinking of the archive as this live space of encuentro. I wanted to talk a little bit about our digital praxis, because I think it's really important to name it and name what we do and not just sort of take it for granted. The way we understand digital praxis is, Chicanx digital praxis is, sort of this Venn diagram of knowledge production, pedagogical memory exchange, transgenerational memory exchange that suits the specific needs of our project, and a community of practice. And so I'm going to define each of these things with examples from our 13 years of work. So first, when we think about knowledge production, yes, at the heart of our project is a repository. And as I mentioned, we have built this very large archive using Cotera, which is a data management system for file sharing for the natural sciences. And we've sort of appropriated it to our use. As it turns out, it's an excellent system for managing multimedia data and sharing. And this is really critical because our project is elaborated not just by the project leads, but across the country by sort of subsidiary, or not subsidiary, affiliated members of the collective, other projects that we support with infrastructure. And so that's just like, this is our data sets, like a screen grab of our data sets, and that's an individual record set. And you can see on the left or right, it has tags, there's descriptions, so it looks very much like an Omeka kind of data management system, but it's much easier to use, and that's why we use it. Like I give logins to little old ladies, and they're able to get in and download their materials that we upload. The other part of knowledge creation for us, or what we see as the central part of knowledge production, is our public-facing website, because this engages the public and allows people a small glimpse into our archival collections. I want to say that students, this website includes bios, timelines, and short historical essays using our archival materials. And students write every bit of this, right? Of course, they're vetted and we edit these pieces, but these are really generated by students who are actively cataloging and interpreting the archival materials that we collect. Also, lately, students have taken to social media to post their reflections on their archival encuentros with particular archives that touch them or speak to them in some way, and also to report back on the oral history trips that we take. This last summer, we went to Colorado, and my daughter, who was on the trip with us, was our social media reporter. So finally, another aspect of knowledge production for us is community partnerships and public engagement. And so we have had 2 shows, but we do a lot of community partnerships. But these 2 shows were in partnership with Detroit, El Museo del Norte, a Detroit Public History Project, which I was also working with at the time, and my classes. So I was teaching classes in the Chicana Archive, and students helped curate these shows. Las Rebeldes was a story of Michigan, Latino migration into Michigan, told through the voices of women that we interviewed and their archival collections. And then Nancy de los Santos is basically, we collected those materials from a photographer right here in Chicago who documented the movement here in Chicago. The other part of that Venn diagram is pedagogy, and that happens in two places, in classrooms or in summer seminars, like training sessions that are multi-week, or in full classrooms. I developed this class, Latina Practices of Oral History, and I basically shared that model, the assignment structure, the syllabus, with other partners who have taught the class regionally in their regionally specific places, like in Houston, and collected oral histories and uploaded them into our repository. So the classroom space is really important for us to move the project forward through our teaching. But we also, as I said, there's a pedagogical aspect to the students, going with us to the interviews, scanning materials, and interpreting those materials too. So we see it as a form of transgenerational memory exchange that has actually very old roots with women of color and particularly Latina communities. So finally, we have the community of practice, and I'm just going to go through this very quickly. This, basically the community of practice means all the people who are engaged in the collective, who are furthering the project. That could be students, it could be faculty we partner with, it could be technologists and cyber infrastructure specialists, librarians and archivists. And so we work, and also community organizations. And I'll show you a few examples of this. In 2021, we taught a summer field school with this professor from UNM, Tessa Cordova, adjunct, by the way. I think that's important to point out, at her Instituto Cultural de Arte called Las Pistoleras in northern New Mexico. We took UNM students there to scan the archive and speak to Enriqueta Vázquez, who's one of the most significant Chicano movement figures, but her archive had not yet been collected. So we scanned it in 2018 and 2021, and we also got it placed because one of our partners on this was the curator of Latino and Latin American collections at UNM, and so we also got it placed there. So our digital archive is not meant to replace the archive, but it's meant to spur archivists into collecting these materials more seriously. This last summer, we did the Chicana Colorado project, similar project with a group of students, but not a whole summer field school. We just did partnering with CSU Pueblo. They have a Chicano movement initiative to document the Chicano movement. So we collected things for them, shared the shared the scanned objects with them and the oral histories, and we're gonna continue this partnership into the future. And next summer, we're partnering with Osa Hidalgo de la Riva, UC Santa Cruz, so the librarian there, and Professor John J. Leaños, who's a media professor. We're gonna do another summer field school collecting 3 generations of queer Latinx culture workers' archives in Santa Cruz. So I just want to say that this is a very complex project. It involves a lot of people, and we see that when you move from a static repository to an active space of encuentro, what you end up building is not just collections, but also intergenerational collectivities. And to wrap it up, this is my last slide. I can't believe I did it. In the 13 years of our praxis, we've really begun to think seriously of naming what it is that we do, and it's in our commitments. And so we've developed these protocols of Chicanx digital memory praxis. And the first and most important thing is it's grounded in Chicana and women of color and indigenous traditions of knowledge and memory keeping, which happen outside the academy. It is collective and collaborative foremost. It is not an individualist pursuit. It can't be. We all know this about DH. It's impossible with DH structurally, but also it's a philosophical commitment. The other thing where we depart a little bit from a traditional DH project is we really center relationships over tools. So we have the most minimum and basic tools that allow the relationships to foster and that allow knowledge sharing to happen in the digital space and in the in IRL space, right? We also center self-determination over visibility or assimilation. Even though the project is really meant to visibilize Chicana activists and to bring greater scholarly attention to them, we don't actively pursue major grants. And one of the reasons why we don't is because by collaborating and by working collectively with other universities, people in universities and community agents, we can actually accomplish what we need to accomplish without having to retool, what we do to serve the sort of guidelines of an NEH or an ACLS. We can talk about that too. We center pedagogy and capacity building over the ownership of knowledge, which means that anything we know about DH and what we've learned, we share with faculty, adjunct students, graduate students. We do trainings all the time. And with these new partner projects, that's what it's really about. It's about building capacity on the ground and then providing infrastructure from a remote area, right? It might, like, trying to have digital infrastructure in northern New Mexico it's not easy, right? So this is one of the things that we can do. We engage in Rasquachi digital practice, which is the creative reuse of existing infrastructures of power. That means, like, we use Cotera, a system developed for the sciences, right? And we use Instagram and other systems that are already pre-existing, but that we can use because they're ready-made. And finally, I think all this work really decenters the university as a site of power by building community knowledge hubs and distributed knowledge networks that aren't only or exclusively in the university, but do rely on the resources of the university. So these partnerships are so incredibly important. And I think that's it. Yeah.
So thank you. Let's give a quick round for all of these really amazing projects. I have to say, like, just listening to y'all and just kind of hearing, like, the differences of all of these projects, but, like, I was immediately sort of struck with how all three of these encapsulate, like, building feminist counterpublics, recovery, archive, the centering of people, making communities visible. But I also really appreciated what you kind of said too, like this idea of, like, decentering our own, like, sort of university archives, or making sure that we're being people forward and that we're really, really, truly focusing on the voices of communities, and that, like, we're not assimilating, we're not washing them down in these kinds of ways. And so I think, like, the first question that I have for all of you is just, I think you're all kind of talking about it in relationship to your projects, but just, like, from a personal kind of praxis, what does, like, doing critical engagement look like for you all individually as practitioners of this? And how do you define being critically engaged? Because I would argue that, like, the work of being critically engaged is a fundamental methodological approach, right? So if you could talk a little bit more about those in your individual projects, or just even, like, kind of where you're coming as practitioners. And I'll let whoever wants to take it.
I guess I'll start by saying simply that my role as an archival instructor in the library, as I mentioned before, that it's important to me to sort of transfer this idea to students that they are historical actors. I think that a lot of the times sometimes they don't even know, because of the position that we're in the building, the actual library, oftentimes they don't even know Special Collections is in the library. Mm-hmm. It is on the 3rd floor of the library. It is tucked on the south end of the building. So oftentimes I'm, just freshly introducing the students to Special Collections. And sometimes I'm able to include some materials from university archives that are related to student history on campus, but sometimes I'm not. So I have to figure out ways to tie in that sort of student history and that student activism into my instruction sessions. Mm-hmm.
I think that doing a digital ethnography, be really immersed in the group of in the feminist fans that I was part of on Twitter. Like, I conducted sort of participant observation for, like, a couple hours every day, really try to, like, read all the things that were flipping through my feed. Oh, fandom is so active, and one of the most active communities online, and just being really immersed and, like, listening to what they were saying instead of just, like, simplifying it. Oh, it's a K-pop fandom. It's a couple girls saying some, criticizing, complaining, just, like, not dismissing it, but being part of it, and making sure that I like understand what they mean when they tell me a lingo that I never heard of. Because, like, a lot of these lingo I introduce are English. So if I like translate it as, like, in English to Korean, then it's like, oh, but then there's, like, a special meaning attached to it, in addition to the English meaning that these fans have appropriated. So just paying careful attention to the meanings that fans have attached to those words, I think for me it was a way of critical engagement.
It's a great question, and I don't know, critical as a modifier, it seems like it could mean so many things. Like the first place I go to is critical ethnic studies, right? Which was a break with the sort of, what critical ethnic studies people called the 4 food groups approach, which was very much about representation, right? And critical ethnic studies, was more about sort of questioning kind of the foundations of the field and, really being critical about the field itself. Right. And so hopefully, and this is a big site of critical ethnic, so like this, there was a lot of organizing here, there's a conference here, right? And so I think in thinking about critical digital humanities in that way, I would have to say, like, what is the value system of DH? And even beyond, like, DH has already been criticized for not being diverse enough, for being very white, and when we started the project, I used to talk a lot actually about how, digital unification projects, which were very popular at that time, basically where you might have an archive like dispersed all through, across 3 or 4 different libraries, right? And digitization enabled that archive to be reunified. And so, of course, when we started our project, thinking about this archipelago, right, of Chicano memory, we were thinking in much the same terms, right? But that also led us to understand that, that DH at that time in 2009, 2010, was really replicating a kind of white Western imaginary,
Absolutely,
right, in the digital space. And so we started asking, well, what happens when your collections aren't in libraries? And when, it's not as simple. I mean, it's never simple for librarians. I know that. Boy, do I know it. But, it's not as simple as getting a clear grant and going and scanning one of your quote unquote hidden collections. Well, if a collection is in a library, it's not hidden.
Right.
I mean, and so, but if it's in a basement, it is. And not only that, it's threatened, and so I feel like for us, I would say in that moment, the critical was very much about like, DH will not save you, right? And so we need to be thinking of or centering other kinds of things, like what happens when DH is not the end, but the means to a different end. And that's kind of, I guess, where like, that whole relationship over tools thing, I think it was Miriam Posner once said like DH is the island of lost tools, because there's so many great ideas that people have and then they kind of wither away, right? And so I think that thinking past the tools, data analytics super important, crunching big data in humanities is critical, but it's not the only thing. And for us, it's really about, what I've come to start calling more like digital care work. Because our histories are disappearing. And there is no infrastructure to collect them. And so it is when you have activists from this is true for sure in Chicago. You have activists from the 70s, whole reams of knowledge.
Absolutely,
that are just, once they pass, that stuff gets put on the curb.
And then where does it go? And we know.
Well, the trash bin.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that I'm glad that you landed there, because that was one of the things that I was talking to Alexis about when she was talking to me about organizing this conference, is that I really have a challenge with marginalized communities being pushed to digital solutions, because we know that digital solutions are not stable, they're not secure, they're oftentimes very expensive, bit rot, so on and so forth. So there has been this sort of conversation, this hint of a conversation of being comfortable with the idea of projects being ephemeral, not lasting into the future, but I also have a problem with that. So in this conversation, I do have a lot of tension about digital humanities broadly.
Yeah, agreed. And I feel like, we started the project because we wanted to force collections to start recognizing them. And what we had identified was a feedback loop, which was happening. Like the historiography is informed by what's in the archive. And if the only thing in the archive is a story of male leaders or male-led organizations without the foot soldiers being described or being accounted for, then those narratives are going to replicate their narratives of erasure. They're just going to replicate what's in the archive. An archivist, goes to her boss and says, "I'd like to collect this woman's, collection," and the boss says, "Is she in the history books?" And she's not. Why? Because she can't be, because she's not in the archive. So it's just like, so we really came up with this project as a way to kind of supercharge archival literacy around what was actually out there, so that libraries would become interested, or it would spur libraries to collect, or in the absence of that it would be a resource for scholars to write articles and books, so that archivists could make arguments about resources vis-a-vis women of color in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like, like such a huge part of that too is that like sometimes, and maybe this is like the librarian in me, but it's like sometimes we don't often take a moment to even in our own work to really think about the cycle of how information is produced and created, right? And so then, I think a lot when I'm helping researchers and we're looking at things that are available and the ways in which knowledge gets reproduced, right? It's only as good as what we have available theoretically, right? And these are just cycles that just continue going in perpetuity over and over and over again. And it's something that I think like researchers, when we're thinking about looking for information or searching for information, we don't even necessarily realize how much these absences are really, really, really impacting our everyday research, our everyday knowledge of a lot of different things, right? And so part of what I'm kind of interested in, because as we were kind of talking about, we know that DH has had a lot of critiques in the beginning about the ways in which, like you were sort of saying, it's replicating a lot of the same models that it has like the radical potential to break, right? And I think we're like already seeing here in many ways, like the ways in which there is that radical potential to break all of that. So I am kind of curious for y'all to talk a little bit more about the ways in which DH has like opened doors, which we kind of talked a little bit about, but also the ways in which the medium has a lot of challenges like built into it that like, we maybe aren't, we kind of get so enamored with the things that it's allowing us to do that we also aren't seeing the other ways in which it's constricting us in other ways.
Well, my question is always to, who is our audience? Like, who are we doing these sort of fancy, data viz, geospatial projects for? Like, we're entertaining each other. Not necessarily the kid on the streets who would be interested in getting their hands on the, the physical materials. But we're sort of moving past that that stage. This is pretty much my broader critique of sort of skipping the tangibleness, the feeling of an actual document, a historical document. And I know this is broadly not about historical things, artifacts, but I'm a special collections librarian, so this is where my mind goes. But I think about even, I'm a critical fan of the Obamas, and I'm thinking about the Obama Center that will be in Hyde Park, and somehow someone was able to convince them that a lot of the presidential materials should be digitized. And I'm like, that's very interesting, because he's moving into this area where a lot of people have not seen an actual presidential document. They have not seen an actual archival document. So I'm all for a hybrid sort of experience. But getting back to DH, yes, the first question that comes to my mind is, who are we doing these projects for?
But Kellee, I think that's like also such a really good and interesting point too, though, right? Which is that, I think DH is like allowing us these kinds of ways to fill in holes where there might not be the kind of stuff, but like to that the sort of things that are not being talked about, right? But like, you know, we should have access to our stuff, right? Like, you know, and I think like that's a huge part of it, right? Like, I think if any of us in this room who have been able to go to an archive and actually like feel and touch a document from like an ancestor or, you know, from the community that you're from, like that's in itself a very, very powerful experience. And I do think that there's something to be said here about how digitization in these ways makes things a lot more accessible, sure, but what ways is it also like kind of cherry picking various people's histories, right? As to who doesn't get access to maybe seeing and or touching and being like, I don't know, maybe I'm a nerd. I like to be like next to documents, I guess. But I think that's just like a very interesting kind of point. And I don't like, you know, I'm thinking about the work that you were kind of doing in the archive and the way that you very much were like trying to decentralize all of that. I don't know if you want to speak to, yeah.
I mean, you know, I'll just speak to this question of like the tangibility of archives. For sure, you know, so basically what we do is we arrive in a location in the past, like our practice has been to identify women, post-custodial. There's a reason for this actually that is political as well, and that is because, you know, in our mother's experience, they were constantly being interviewed and, you know, solicited for their stories. People were borrowing archival objects and not returning the scholars. And all these women from this generation really have a lot of suspicion about scholars bearing gifts, right? When scholars come around, sniffing around you, you know something's going to turn up missing. And so this was part of what this experience kind of informed the post-custodial nature of this project. Of course, we didn't have the institutional space to collect actual things, but it was also intentional. Like, we leave things in place. We don't even take things to wherever we're staying to scan.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Usually, I've been in women's homes till like 4 or 5 a.m.
Gotcha, okay, wow.
And they're cool with it. I'm not like, breaking into their homes. Right? They're okay with it. But I think that, you know, in our experience, having the students really engage with the materiality of personal collections in particular, because what then becomes very evident is that the archive might be in a box or, you know, under a bed or in a closet, but there's also like stuff on the walls, there's awards, there's, you know, students really get a sense of the ways in which archives are not isolated, you know, to documents that are well filed away in acid-proof folders. Like the archive, you know, I showed one quick picture of it, but this is our, you know, reality that we're often doing that first pass, and students are doing that, you know, which is really powerful and profound, especially when they're minoritized students, right?
That is another point, is that, you know, often I've read in the literature that, you know, certain students are involved in sort of archiving or creating metadata or, you know, getting exposure to these DH tools, and often they're white students. They're white students working on, you know, oral histories. I can think of something that I just read and reviewed recently, a project of a oral history collection where the author basically said, oh, it doesn't really matter who, you know, we just wanted students to come in, and that meant that it was white students who were learning about these DH tools and learning how to preserve oral histories, even though the oral histories were of Black women in that region. So I feel like it's important that we also identify, and this is a part of this collaborative approach broadly, is that if you're in a position of power and you're very familiar with digital humanities concepts and tools, that you bring in the people and the students that are related to those collections, especially if they're multi-ethnic collections.
Also, I, you know, listening to your conversation, because I was just thinking about like, oh, it's so cool, digital humanities, all this visualization, and I'm just like realizing the importance of like archival data, and not just the archival data, but remembering, respecting the process in which it was made. And I think sort of the power of digital humanities, or just what it can do, is that it can actually like it can get into the process too. Like as I mentioned, like we can now study the data in situ, like as they're being produced. If you think about sort of the data that's being produced digitally, like fan fiction archives, and like something that I wonder that I could have done is kind of partnering with these feminist fan accounts that we're collaborating with, because we use the word capture, right? Like capture the data, screen grab. Don't let it get deleted. Exactly. And I think I was doing that. Like I was like, oh my gosh, my feed is exploding. I need to capture all this data. But I think that if I were to partner, if I were to actually like, use my funding to like support their activity, support their parties that they threw online, I think that I could be part of that production process and make it less exhausting for them who are creating all this, data for us, the researchers to then go do whatever they want with it. And so that was something that I will always sort of keep remembering, like I could have been more involved, and how could I do that for my next project?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was I was literally just about to say that. So I was going to say, I was like, on that, I was going to open it up to see what other questions we have. Hannah.
Yes. Thank you all so much for all the wonderful presentations. My question was for Dr. Cotera. I was wondering if you've ever taken on the role of advocating for someone who was contributing to your archive, to have that housed in an institution's archive. Have you ever, what was that process like, and is that a goal that you have going forward for your project?
Well, so the summer field school that we did in northern New Mexico and Taos last summer, we put together a team, because we had already, so we had gone to interview this woman in 2018, and I had assumed that a major library had already collected her archive, because it's just extremely significant in the history of the Chicano movement. She was one of the editors of El Grito del Norte, which is widely understood to be a newspaper of national significance. It ran from 69 to 74, right? So in the middle of the movement years, and worked with Betita Martinez. She's very, very well known. She's got a volume of her writing out, I mean, that's how well known she is. When we arrived at her house, she lives in adobe in the mountains. And a bear, all her materials were in a goat shed. And she's like, oh, I'm so glad you got here, because just last week there was a bear in there. And I was like, oh my God, And so, and when I visited Betita Martinez in 2010, she's actually very well known in SNCC and Black Liberation Circles. She was a SNCC New York secretary. She worked on El Grito. Like, she's very, very well known. She ran for governor of California on the Peace and Justice ticket. Her archive was in San Francisco in a garden apartment in the garage. So, we advocate, in that case, in 2010, I started working with her daughter to contact all the major collections that I knew of, and I produced a list, and then her group of leftists, her circle of leftists in the Bay Area actually raised funds, organized fundraisers to get the archive appraised, because it was going to be like $2,000. And we were able to get her, get Stanford to purchase her archive. And so with Enriqueta Vasquez, this time we approached it a little bit differently. We put together in our teaching team for this field school, the curator of Latino and Latin American collections. So she taught students about archival theory. Mm-hmm. And she was our major conduit to getting the materials into the archive and to get that paid, actually, which almost never happens with the archival collections of women of color.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. In my institution, we found ourselves in that position where we are doing digital collections for community members, but we want those materials to be housed and protected, and they don't really trust our institution. But we've established trust, and so we are facilitating it. And so I appreciate that answer, because we're trying to kind of strategize, because I think this is going to happen.
There's a lot of bad blood, actually, between, really women of color, is what I've seen, and archival institutions. And my mother was an archivist at the Benson Latin American Collection, and in some cases she wasn't an archivist, she was an archival consultant, community liaison. But she saw materials that she collected, whole runs of newspapers tossed. Wow.
Oh,
And when
wow.
I was at U of M, actually, I had found a whole cab, a Latino Studies director at University of Michigan, and I found all these archival, like stretching back to the foundation of the program. I took it to the library to have it, to donate it. And 8 years later, I was director again, and the library returned the exact same box to me, saying they were deaccessioning it.
Mm.
So they
Okay.
returned it to my office. So like, it's not just not collecting, it's also deaccessioning does happen. And it often happens to collections that aren't seen as valuable, but valuable to who?
Absolutely. Laura.
Thanks. I'm Laura Hostetler, Director at Humanities Institute here on campus. And I want to ask you some questions about, I guess, with a slightly more epistemological angle. And maybe more on the community engagement side, even than the DH, so I think both are important. But I think I noticed in each presentation, you sort of pulling on threads that open up questions of ways of knowing that might transcend more traditional ways of knowing. So remember our first speaker, you talked about this language of doing feminism rather than being a feminist and how to open things up. Or Kellee, you talked about the embodied knowledge in the dance and representing that. And our third speaker more about, the importance of the relationship with the groups. So I wonder how the practices that you're doing, both in terms of digital humanities and in terms of relationships in the community, might help reconstitute how we know in the university, and not just what we know. What we know is important. Who we know things about is all important. But I don't know. I would love if you would maybe take that a step further. And that's open to any and all of you.
I think this is something that I addressed in a previous conference. I was kind of thinking about it, and I don't have any answers. But because I always start, let me just start from the beginning. I always start with this sort of data, demographic data in librarianship broadly, and then I narrow it down to special collections, librarianship, and archives specifically. And the thing is that somehow librarianship and archives has been able to exclude Black people and other people of color from the profession for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So my position here on campus is a challenge. It's a challenge. And for me, being a professional special collections librarian, I'm sort of a hybrid between librarian and archivist because I did get my experience in processing collections, that I was trying to think of ways how the special collections library and the university, I guess broadly, could nurture those community relationships. And the only thing that I could come up with as an insider is that I nurture the relationships internally on campus because of the lack of trust and the history of universities in general. When they move into neighborhoods, they oftentimes obliterate relations in neighborhoods. And it's the case with this university as well. This university, there was a few neighborhoods that were raised in order to make sure that this university was here. So I sit in a place of just ultimate tension, and I'm still thinking about those questions myself.
So I wrote about this question exactly in a contribution to Chicana Movidas called Unpacking My Mother's Library. And in that, I really lay out a kind of, I think through tradition of knowledge production that could be understood as historiographic and personally reflective, that is articulated by Ansaldúa. For example, Gloria Ansaldúa, when she talks about autohistoria, this idea of a kind of putting history through a sieve, And I focus on collecting practices in resource production and sharing as knowledge practices, and how that's not valued by historians that much. So anyone who was around in the 70s knows that bibliographies were probably the most important knowledge object of ethnic studies and women's studies. Like, it was the source of every syllabus. It was before people had writings. The Chicana feminists had not produced writings, but they had bibliographies that were, that they shared, and so I think about these, as historians and scholars, we usually, kind of imagine our genealogies, development of a certain political thought around texts. This text came first, then this one, then this one. But, I was like, what about these memory practices? What about these knowledge practices that are non-textual, that are about, aggregating and combining and, producing and sharing knowledge that can't be confined to a single text? And it's one of the reasons why, Chicanas in particular are invisibilized, because so much of their work between 1969 and 1979 was about aggregating knowledge. It was a work of librarianship, a radical librarianship, but it was about aggregating knowledge so it could be disseminated, in those early years. And because there's no knowledge object no one wants to write a dissertation about bibliographies. At least no one I know. It should be written. But, so epistemology, I was linking this to a much longer tradition of knowledge, like altar building, memory keeping, storytelling. These are all forms of memory and archive that are not seen as scholarly, but they're traditions of knowledge that I think are much more widely shared than the very tiny, scholarly practice that we see as knowledge. There's actually a whole universe of knowledge sharing.
Yeah, related to sort of it's been there before. I think that, your question about, being a feminist to identifying feminists, actually this project was part of my research on feminist leadership. So, I asked these feminist friends that I interviewed, do you identify as a leader? And they were like, no, I'm a femme. I may be a feminist, but I'm not a leader. What? No. And I realized that a lot of them thought leadership not as a position. They thought leadership was a position. Right. But what I was looking at is that they took leadership in their actions, right? They built community partners. They created this account. It's a lot of work, archiving problematic lyrics and comments. And so I think that for me, there's an idea that we live in a movement society. These fans have appropriated, social movement tactics, and I think we could think the other way, how these fans are giving rise to this culture, this way of thinking about feminist leadership in different way in different communities, like fandom, doing really creative actions of leadership, and how that can change how we think about movement leadership and who it changes society in what ways.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. I was going to say, I just see your hand, Mark.
I'm the only hand.
So you're rounding us out. You're rounding us out.
Thank you so much for this incredibly inspiring panel, and I love the way you've given so much. All three of you have given us, and Teresa too, so much substance to the idea of critical digital humanities. Fantastic. I have a question that's more for Yena than for the others, but others may have something to say about it. I was really struck by how you are really interested in some ways of approaching this archive with some methods that sound so much like the bread and butter of literary studies, the resonance of certain terms, a sort of metaphoricity of the language that you're using. And it really struck me as you were talking, beyond just the pleasure of being a literary person and hearing the literary terminology, it struck me how crucial and rewarding the close reading can still be when we approach the digital. So I was wondering if this is an important part of your methodology to revive the importance of close reading within that way of analyzing the text.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for really elaborating my work in that way, because when I was, because I identify myself as a social scientist, so I conducted digital ethnography, and so I was like, I'm immersed in the field, like I am, like I'm listening to them, I'm like trying to be aware of things that are going on, but like the thing about Twitter, the thing about social media is that everything, what's going on is through text, right? And I think that there's definitely a need for social scientists to not only treat like the social media environment as an in-person environment. Like there's definitely that layer of text that's happening, right? It's the person writing the tweet then gets interpreted by the researcher. So I do really appreciate your pointing out that really the close reading is sort of what we need to work on when it comes to doing digital ethnography and doing social science research, because honestly I don't think that a lot of digital ethnographers are really sort of talking about the importance of close reading, and I think the DH has a lot to attribute to that. So I do want to continue my research in online spaces, and not just Korean, but like American, also like Brazilian, because I lived in Brazil. So and I'm starting to wonder how that translation, how my knowledge about translation could then influence my research further in languages that's not Korean. Even in English too, like considering the communities, there could be differences in how different communities interpret certain words. And so, yeah, I mean, thank you for pointing that out. Like, I'm just starting to think about it too.
Yeah. Well, that was an excellent question to land on. I want to thank you all so much for sharing your projects and sharing your approaches and your the ways in which you're all engaging in this, not to be like critical work, but also critical work. And thank you all so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to spend the afternoon with you, and hopefully we will be seeing you around for the next few days. And then I don't know if there are other comments or anything. Okay, well then we're good. We did it.